Good morning to you, Rosanne Somerson, President of RISD.
Glenn.
Great to see you. I'm going to take a wild surmise and guess that you are in Providence, Rhode Island.
Very good guess.
Never far from campus, I would imagine.
No, no. I have been pretty much here nonstop since March.
Yeah, yeah.
In this spot almost.
And in front of this screen, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if folks have questions as we hear from Rosanne and we have a conversation together with her, please send them to the gallery on the chat box, and we'll get back to them in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the conversation. But first, I wanted to start off, Rosanne, with a little plug actually for another interview that you did, because it went into such depth, and I thought in a remarkably sensitive way on many of the challenges that RISD is facing at the moment. Having said this, this was actually a couple of weeks ago already, and I know things are moving along quickly. But that interview was with the podcast At a Distance, which is a project by Spencer Bailey and Andrew Zuckerman. And I definitely recommend those of you who want to hear even more from Rosanne about the current situation to check that out. But I did want to start our conversation also by asking just what's on your mind and how RISD is coping with this unbelievable cascade of events that we've had in 2020 so far, and also, of course, how you're looking ahead to the fall of 2020 student experience, staff, and faculty experience. And if you could give us a kind of brief sketch of how RISD is trying to navigate these troubled waters.
How much time do we have? No, I'll be brief.
Yeah.
It's so complex. It's that's I guess the first thing I would say because this is for without a doubt the biggest challenge we've faced in our entire history as an institution, 143 years. But we're not alone in that. I mean, everyone's facing it, and so I think what's coming from this time is a real sense of what you value, what matters, what is your priority. And in our case, it is providing a RISD kind of education with a lot of invention attached to it. And in March, when we were forced to send our students back home, or at least off campus, we had so little warning. And we did it, I think, incredibly seamlessly, but it was traumatic for the students. I mean, this is not at all what they had anticipated, and it was done sort of to them and to all of us rather than by them. So it was very difficult, and it raised all kinds of issues of all kinds of inequities and complexities. But our faculty were amazing and really went sort of student by student to create circumstances so that the students could learn the objectives of the classes in very inventive ways. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that today. But since then, the world has changed again 5 times. And, we're dealing with trying to imagine a completely reinvented school that has a way of teaching and methods of learning that are very successful but can't be used at the moment. So we're actually rebuilding our entire campus right now for the summer. We're opening in the fall with what we're calling a de-densified manner. So we're essentially taking over all the spaces in campus that we can and making them studios that have different distancing procedures, et cetera. We're expanding the space between equipment. We're adding opportunities for students to still be in the making facilities, but with the distancing and the protocols for disinfecting, et cetera, that will keep them as healthy as possible. So it's a huge task, and so we're in the process of going course by course and coming up with 3 sort of modalities. One, fully online, which will be a lot of our critical theory courses and seminar courses that can meet that way effectively. Some that will be hybrid courses where there will be lectures online and then making in the facilities, and some will be fully in person. So it's like, and we have over 800 classes, so we're going class by class and basically rebuilding the space and the teaching space for each class. So it's a very complex process, and that's just the academic side. We're doing the same for housing and dining and incredible systems for all of that. And we're also inventing numerous online activities and kind of ways to build community. And it's a daunting task, but there are some really wonderful things that are happening that wouldn't have ever happened. For example, we're able to bring in internationally acclaimed critics into our classes who generally wouldn't be able to travel to do critiques. People like Glenn Adamson sometimes has been there in person, but there are some who can't make it there for either age or distance or whatever reason. We're also starting a new thing of artist studio tours and visits, which, so artists are opening up their studios so that our students can sort of have a bird's eye view without traveling. So there are numbers of things that we've learned from this experience that are actually expanding our learning footprint in very exciting ways.
Hmm. It strikes me that in a funny way, art schools are very well set up to cope with this situation because they're filled with creative people who are used to inventing forms of expertise almost on a moment's notice because they're so inventive, fundamentally. And I've been fortunate enough to be a visiting critic in the printmaking and ceramics departments at RISD, and I definitely saw that both in the reactions of the faculty, but also the students, and just seeing what the students were able to come up with over the course of the past 2 or 3 months from often just their living room, sometimes in a one room apartment, and what they were able to make just by going outside on their own or at their desk. It was absolutely inspiring to see that.
Yeah.
And I felt like it was almost modeling the way that the culture in general should be responding to this crisis. It was really, really something to see that. I did want to also ask you, as you said, the world has changed so much and there's been so much to think about recently. I also wanted to ask you what the conversations at RISD around the recent Black Lives Matter
Hmm.
inspired and led protests have been.
Yeah.
And there have been some statements coming out from yourself and RISD about that, but I wonder if you would also want to, another huge topic, but if you'd want to briefly address that.
Sure. Well, they're inextricably linked. A lot of the reason that Black Lives Matter is happening now has to do with politics and police and 400 years of uh, of an awful legacy. But it also, the COVID virus has exposed really deep inequities in populations and healthcare and the workforce and just every aspect of life. So it's amplified this horrific truth about structural racism in America. And at RISD, our students are very active, our faculty are very active. So we've been having some very difficult conversations. And when I started as president, my first big initiative was a social equity and inclusion initiative and building an office to begin to untangle RISD's history in this and really look to the future. And the students were a big part of developing that. They had a lot of voice in that as well. And now they don't want to hear about the past. They don't want to see the trajectory of change that we've made, which has been significant, but they're looking at what's wrong now, and they're right to be doing that. So we have our work cut out for us, and we'll be announcing a number of new commitments and initiatives in about 3 weeks. And that's just the beginning. But it I think that for everyone to not recognize that this is a movement that is so long overdue and is so it's so baked into to everything that it is absolutely an imperative that everyone begins to admit the fact that they may not feel their own, people say they're not racist, but if they're not actively acting against racism, they're part of the problem. So it has to be a very proactive time. And, RISD is going to be a strong voice in that change.
Mm, yeah, I really appreciate the first thing you said too, which is that the two developments are related.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, the crisis of the pandemic, and on the other hand, this really long overdue explosion of awareness and the urgency that's come with that, and the horrible fact of the two things being occurring at the same time, but also the impact of COVID on the Black and Brown communities in the country. So there's a huge amount to think about and deal with institutionally and individually, I guess you might say.
Absolutely. And, the involvement of the opportunities to be involved in the political arena right now and to the amount of change that is in process right now is really moving, but it's long overdue.
Yeah, yeah, and we're feeling the weight of that
That's
um,
right.
that delay. That these things should have been dealt with by previous generations, but it's our generation that's facing up to them.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in the for generations. Yeah.
Well, let's look at some images now and go to campus because it will give us maybe some additional feeling for what this response has been like,
Sure.
particularly with respect to the necessary evacuation of working spaces. And so, please take us through this kind of brief tour of what's been happening at RISD and kind of response.
Sure. So I'm going to give you a snapshot with a few projects just to demonstrate the point that I think you made very well, which is the fact that, artists and designers, if you think about their practice, it's making things that have never existed before. It's sort of taking the proverbial blank sheet of paper and bringing it to life. So this notion of dealing with incredible uncertainty and totally new territory is the realm of artists and designers. It's the realm in which they perhaps have the best skill set to move forward. So I think it is telling that art and design students, as traumatic as this experience was, really managed to make some incredible discoveries during this time. And I'm going to try and show you a couple of them. If we can just go to the first slide. This is a work that I'll talk about in a minute, but it kind of captured, I think, the way we all felt. It's like the entire world was just turned upside down instantaneously, in every way that we knew. And it happened so suddenly without kind of preparation. So it was jarring. And, we saw everything differently immediately because we had to. If you can go to the next slides, there are a couple of images here that just show the kind of somber nature of empty creative spaces without students and faculty in them, and the loneliness. And for us, this was kind of devastating because these are spaces that we are usually noting with incredible bustling activity and creativity, and instead they look like this. I think there might be one more, and it just kind of captures the feeling of isolation and what was left behind. But all of the students who left took that same kind of isolation with them in their different ways. Sorry, we have dogs and stuff happening, but this is
Real life.
Zoom in the yes. Um, so in addition to that, we have, as all higher ed and many cultural institutions, an incredible financial crisis that we're also managing at the same time, and that's going to affect us for a long time. But that's something that we're not, again, alone in. This is kind of higher ed and museums and a lot of arts foundations and institutions are suffering the same challenges, but we suffered on a fairly large scale. But there were also wonderful aspects that came out of this, and I wanted to show you some of the specific projects. This is going to be some examples of a work by glass artist Sean Sostrom, who's one of our glass faculty, and people were saying things like, there's no way you can teach something like glass remotely. And, Sean is a fantastic assistant professor. And so he sent all the students home. He was teaching a course on optics and the way that glass and light interact. And so he sent all the students home with a kit that he put together that included a prism, a spherical lens, a high-end laser pointer, and a telescope that had a cell phone camera mount, so that they could continue to explore and observe light and optics from wherever they were in their classes. And if we go to the next one, this is an interesting investigation by a student named Amanda Lee, who is a graduate student in the glass department. And she was studying the optical behavior of isomalt, which is a beet-derived sweetener that can be used as a material substitute for glass. Now, this is probably something that wouldn't have happened in the glass studio because there'd be other wonderful distractions, but these were the kind of explorations that creative people engaged in that had some incredible results. And if we go to the next one, this is this image again by Yuqing Ma, who's a graduate student in industrial design. And for Yuqing, the constrained studio environment of self-isolation itself became a source of inspiration. And so with very simple reflective materials, she created an interactive optical environment in her bedroom. And she's now considering translating this into a window that she would have manufactured with the same materials so that any space could be similarly enlivened. So again, sort of a new set of discoveries that came out of this adversity.
Can I just add a little comment of my own on this
Sure.
point, which is just that one thing that really struck me in talking to the students that I was working with at RISD was that uh, by essentially having to withdraw from the facilities of RISD, which are very impressive, they were almost placed in a position of that was akin to being an amateur again. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? Because you might say, well, the difference between an amateur and a professional is actually more to do with infrastructure and equipment
Hmm.
and sort of institutional positioning than anything else. And it really brought to the fore the individual personality of the students in a lot of cases in ways that was so strong. And I am feeling a little bit of that even in these first examples that you've shown, like the very strong sense of place and psychology that you get in this image and this perspectival nature of it. I
Hmm.
find that really gets right to the heart of what it is to be an artist in a way,
Yeah.
um, leaving behind these differences between amateurism and professionalism that we often talk about and take for granted.
Yeah, and I think also just the capturing in such a simple way of what we were all feeling, this kind of upside down, inside out nature of life suddenly. And I would say, I think you're right in talking about this as something that sort of defines an amateur. It also defines an accomplished artist just starting out, that doesn't necessarily have access to all the equipment or all the facilities. So how can you translate the things that you absolutely need and have to say with other kinds of tools and outcomes? And that's very much the spirit of a lot of what happened over this, uh, this springtime.
It's kind of economy of means in a way.
Exactly.
You know.
So this project I just find incredibly poetic. Earlier in the semester, Sean, this is the same Sean Salstrom's class, had invited Peter Gallison from the Event Horizon Telescope team to give a presentation to the class about his team's work imagining a black hole through a global network of synchronized observations that work in unison to observe radio sources associated with black holes. And so it was the cumulative effect of all the responses around the globe that actually helped to define what the, the, the reaction was. And so, modeling from that, Sean, in a very simple way, wanted to do something similarly but more poetic. And so he had all of the students from wherever they are shoot with the equipment kits that he had sent to them images of the moon on May 3rd at 2020 at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so, and the time zones in this particular group of students allowed them to all get images at that point. And there's a great difference in quality here and clarity, and this is due to some very specific things which I think add to the power of the image, which is that the students were sort of amateurs with this equipment. This was new to them. They didn't know how to master the absolute precision of the telescope attachment. Also, because of their different circumstances and social distancing factors, some were looking directly out of a window, some were looking from an apartment and with a different skewed perspective. So it also speaks to where they were and their circumstance. And also, he didn't direct them on how to use the eyepiece, which is the magnification piece. So they all interpreted the use of that on their own. And so this became this sort of collaborative homage in a way to the moon, from people viewing one moon from a multitude of circumstances and locations. And again, I think really captures the fact that of this particular time that we're in, where we're all experiencing this pandemic in our own individual ways across the globe. But it is one world and it is one human, human and animal population across the globe that's all sort of experiencing this together. So I found this very moving in its kind of simple, poetic gesture.
Reminds me a little bit of the way that people have been standing outside to clap for the
Exactly.
frontline
Yeah.
healthcare workers in the sense of being apart and together at the same time, and everybody directing their gaze in the same way at the same time and focusing on that important
Yeah,
idea of
exactly.
connection.
I think it also brings out how we are such social beings, and so people are finding all kinds of new ways to create community from isolation. And I'm sure every one of us can tell a story about an old friendship or something that's been rekindled, through this period when you actually have time to think and miss people and miss communication.
Yeah.
So let's go to the next one and talk about another kind of invention, which was a critic in the film animation video studio, Gina Kamensky, and she created a step-by-step PDF tutorial complete with images and drawings for each student on how to make a down shooting stand out of a cardboard box to shoot animation, so that the students could use their smartphone camera and still work on their stopgap animations using this plan. So, I mean, look at how simple this is. And to our earlier conversation about, perhaps being a master, maker or artist or designer, but not having full access to the tools, the kind of ingenuity piece that comes from learning how to solve a problem this ingeniously it's a lesson in and of itself. And if you look at the next slide, this is just one improvised studio by Sydney Mills, a junior in the department. And this is a stop motion animation studio that she set up, in her Texas room, so that she could continue working on her animation. And I don't want to underplay the fact that that there are benefits to having the full range of incredible facility that we have, but there are also times when people may want to be shooting in parts of the world that don't have access to those, or it actually, when you think about access and the ability to be more inclusive about who gets to make art and how, there are lots of important lessons here that I think we can learn from and take forward into really interesting new terrain.
I
You
guess,
know,
Roseanne, it must be it's kind of a nuanced conversation because, as you say, you don't want to, in a way, make the mistake of celebrating the ingenuity that people have in these reduced circumstances to the extent that you either inadvertently disregard the difficulties that they might be having in
right.
that same situation, or indeed forget how important it is to have all these facilities that RISD has invested so much in and what that brings to an artistic career, just thinking about ceramics, for example, and everything that you really need to be a top flight ceramics practitioner. So
Mhm.
it's a really tricky balancing act to think about, isn't it? The way that we all respond to this moment of restricted circumstances and how we find our way into celebrating what individual students and faculty are doing without almost going too far in the other direction and ignoring the challenges that they're also facing.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about sequencing. I think that, that the knowledge gained in improvisation and in making things happen that needed to happen is just an incredible skill set. But it's not instead of the ability to then come back and use studios. I think it's having the versatility to be able to function in multiple levels of engagement for your practice is really the takeaway. And both in teaching and making, for the students, for the faculty too, they really had to think deeply about how to get the students' experience to be what their intention for the class was. So the faculty also expanded their teaching language and repertoire, but certainly this is not instead of, it's a part of, I think, a sequence of learning.
Yeah, and everyone's on the learning curve, not just the students, that's for sure.
Yeah, and even and audiences too, right? The way that we're engaging audiences. This is from our apparel department, and Lisa Morgan, who is the head of the apparel department, wanted her students to what she called build a muscle of resource while working with less, which is, I think, a
Mhm.
very nice way to articulate
Great.
what we're talking about. And so she, again, a lot of faculty prepared these sort of kits and materials, et cetera, to send students home with. And for the apparel students, some of them went home with dress forms and sewing machines and knitting machines and tools so that they could continue. The seniors, of course, have a whole collection that's due at the end of the year. So it was very important for them to be able to make their collections. But there have been some wonderful interviews with students about the ingenuity of working with materials around them in their own home, in their own environment that they just had overlooked, rather, when being more accustomed to acquiring materials in a certain way. And Lisa's approach is very much about thinking more critically about resources themselves and production methods and fashion overall in terms of its impact on the environment. So seniors doing their year-end shows knew that they had to present them remotely, and she urged them to really think about that as an opportunity and devise original ways for communicating their ideas to the fashion industry, which would be coming to look at these, latest designers and the world beyond. So this is the work of a graduating senior, Desiree Nicole Scarborough, whose Hood ice cream collection you see here. And on the next slide is one of the places where she began seeing what Lisa and the student were calling the new possible. So the idea that it's that out of these kind of limitations come incredible opportunities for creativity and for rethinking how we find materials and how we express with them. And in her artist statement, Desiree, who's a Brooklyn-based artist, admitted that she felt really uncomfortable to share personal details of her life, but her designs could do that as kind of a bold breakthrough, drawing on the experiences of her grandparents. And I think a lot of students really connected with their families in different ways because they were sort of forced to. And but in Desiree's case, she was drawing on the experience of her grandparents who came north from the South, and her own childhood in Brooklyn and how it shaped the personage of a young Black female artist and designer.
That's fascinating, that thing about being a master's student and also being with your family at the same time, and the way that those two experiences can hybridize with one another. That's really, really interesting. And I was also thinking, Rosanne, that in the future, don't you think that these projects, if viewed from a distance of 20 or 30 or 50 years, they're going to seem so resonant of this thing that we've all been through in a way that maybe nothing else does? What does a 20-something-year-old student do to react? And I just hope there's some museums and curators around there who are going to collect these and keep them safe, because
Absolutely.
it's so powerful.
Well, we've created in our library, we have an archive. So we're creating an archive of COVID projects from students, faculty, and alumni to really mark this moment because it is so historic. And so it is very important. And interestingly, a lot of when we first went remote, I got, many concerning letters from parents and students in the apparel department. Wait a minute, the launch of our show is so important to our careers, and that's part of being in a good art and design school, is that you expect that the public will come to you and the industry will come to you. We had amazing coverage for our senior show. We were in we were in Vogue. There were videos from our student kind of mini runway show sort of things. And this particular graduating class got phenomenal connections and publicity out of this. So it is really interesting, the sort of nice surprises that came from this very difficult set of circumstances.
And Rosanne, am I right in thinking that there's still a master's degree show that's coming in the fall? Is that correct?
Yes, so we're going to have we just launched, and we can send the link for it, our online senior show and graduate shows, which are phenomenal, but we will have in-person shows. We're still working on the scheduling for those based on when we can, get people in enough mass to actually attend them. So those things are still being developed by the state.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if we go to this project, which is the Phillips Sterile Industrial Village in East Providence, and this was a project site for our landscape architecture department. And in their core studio, which is a site ecology design studio, they used this site to sort of create a mock RFP for the remediation and transformation of what is a really derelict industrial village on the waterfront in East Providence. And they set this up almost like a competition would run, so that they were mirroring what they would experience in the professional world, which was a slightly different approach than they were going to take when they were working on campus. But they wanted to look at this site as a potential site for social interaction, for some kind of dynamic industrial innovation and sustainability around biodiversity. So the instructors created a website, and we can go to the next slide, that gave a very specific, detailed project brief that would be the kind of thing that would happen in a professional competition. And they also included, because of the fact that it was digital, they were able to incorporate an extensive archival documentation about the history of the site. And they grouped students into design teams. And students got really excited by this new exercise because it was so much a mirror of how they might work in the professional world. And but it was certainly not without its challenges. They didn't necessarily have the tools that they typically have for making models. So we set up a kind of shop in a using some of our printing machines and laser cutters and digital fabrication stuff on site, and then had a container that made parts for students. And in some cases, the local students were able to pick them up and use them for models, but there was some material that got sent to other students. So again, finding a way to work that mirrors what might be more typical in the professional setting than in a setting where you have every kind of tool, at your fingers' reach. And landscape architecture firms, as I'm sure many, listeners know, are increasingly staffed by designers who work collaboratively from remote locations. So this was a great opportunity to try that and give them a taste of that. And if we go to the next two slides, these are just some of the studies that were created for part of the proposal by two Chinese students, Lulu Hao and Yu Zhao. And the next slide, these are some of the studies that they did to talk about aspects of components that would be dealing with both the eco reality of the site and also the development of the site. And if we go to the next one, this is kind of the more final stage of the design that shows different uses and circulation pattern of development on the site. And if we go to the next one, I wanted to show another project by our interior architecture department, because our department is very much centered around adaptive reuse. And when it comes to issues of architecture and sustainability, one could argue that the greenest green use of buildings is reuse of buildings. And so we have a wonderful publication called INTAR that the department also publishes that really features exemplar works that use that concept of adaptive reuse. And we're kind of known globally for that, for being leaders in that field. And this summer, this spring, our graduate students took on an iconic building, which I'm sure you know, Glenn, in Providence. You can go to the next slide, called the Superman Building. And it's actually the real name is the Industrial Trust Building, but it's a sort of iconic Art Deco building in the middle of Providence, and it's pretty much a exact similar building to the Daily Planet building in Superman, which is why it's called the Superman Building. And actually, recently, this has been included in the National Trust list of America's 11 most endangered historic places, interestingly enough. But it's a very iconic part of the Providence landscape. And so a new owner recently built it, named David Sweetser, who is I haven't had a chance to meet him yet, but I understand he's very imaginative about what this building might become. So he engaged our students to collaborate with the Providence Preservation Society and the City Planning Office on possible new uses. And so the students started out by touring the building. And if we go to the next slide, this is a really interesting intervention, which is Shreya Anand's super farmer concept, which Providence is a city that has a very active and renowned food culture. In part, Johnson & Wales is there, which has a great culinary program. And there's because it's such a small region with so many fabulous growers, there's a real artisanal farm and producing network here that the restaurants and a lot of suppliers are all connected. So Anand proposed converting this landmark building into a vertical farm using state-of-the-art hydroponic technology And then the monumental lobby would become a kind of Kunsthal for a changing exhibition of the history of food and the culinary arts. And then the bank vault, which was it's a very impressive part of the building, would become a national seed repository so that it had this archive of seeds. And then the top floors would house several farm-to-table restaurants. So it's a really interesting take on a building that was completely in a different direction than I think anyone had thought of prior to that time. And if you go to the next slide, if you have a phone that you want to print the QR code, you can get a whole augmented reality scene of the interior of the building and what it would look like after its farm conversion. And I don't know, maybe we can post the QR code later if people want to play with that. And if we go to the next slide, there's a lot of interest in, of course, augmented reality, and in interior architecture there is a very strong interest also in exhibition design. So this is a image that graduating majors in the department wanted to create an augmented reality version of a senior show in a replication that they created of the Grand Gallery of the RISD Museum. And if you download their app, you can actually play with this, but I'm just going to show you a couple of images. So if you go to this one and you click, you can see that it's an interactive image of the students' exhibition in the gallery, so that you can look into these viewing things and see the kind of spaces and constructions that the student created. So it was a very inventive way of creating an exhibition. And if you go into the next slide, we'll use some of the same kind of thinking in a large project that was a multidisciplinary project. And Glenn, as you know, we have a very famous and special facility at RISD, the renowned Edna Lawrence Nature Lab. This is just one room of it, but it has over 80,000 natural history specimens. It's an extraordinary resource. We also have a menagerie of living animals, including some small mammals, reptiles, fishes, arthropods, mollusks, jellyfish, and other invertebrates. And we have really high-end data visualization equipment, electron microscopes. We can freeze dry things. We have wet labs. We have a living lab in the space that has a green growing wall and a place for biomaterial making. So it's quite elaborate. And we are starting to use it really as building on it as a research site to look at the interaction between the systems of nature and the systems of design and the future. So we partnered on a kind of multi-semester work with Hyundai Motor Corporation to propose new directions for the future of mobility. And students in this work considered strategies that were as far-ranging as interspecies collaboration, questioning whether the unique and symbiotic cycle of humans and the rest of the natural world might partner to sort of harness novel outcomes regarding movement and transport, and also investigating the potential of eco-repair in their scheme. So asking questions that could human activity actually contribute to restoring the natural environment rather than negatively impact it. And if we go to the next slide, this research, this is an example in our materials making, biomaking area, where we have this living wall and some of our aquariums and other natural, real living environments. And these are some of the students who were part of a team. There were 4 faculty members that led separate research groups, each bringing particular design strengths to the questions that Hyundai was very openly presenting to us to explore. They were incredibly wonderful partners in this project, and it was a very competitive pool of students to get in. And some of the 4 different areas, one was Anthropocene to Aerocene through Biocene, which was a group that explored alternative trajectories to the future of mobility, guided by artistic and scientific and philosophical provocations. There was another group called Sound Design for Mobility that drew from the fields of bioacoustics and soundscape ecology to develop novel auditory displays and sonic experiences in a project that they called Making the Unheard Heard. And we're very fortunate to have a sound studio, a spatial sound studio that is a very special facility that the students worked in for that project. And then another one was called Post-Human Mobility, from Molecule to Machine, that focused on developing models for collaboration directly with diverse forms of nature, such as designed nature and cyborg nature, and looking at interspecies collaboration so that different forms of life could evolve together in regard to movement and transport, which is not typically the way that mobility is thought about. And I was especially intrigued by some of the work of a textile design for mobility group. These are some of the members of that group. And if we go to the next slide, they speculated on the future of mobility in regard to mass migration that was a result of climate and political change, and also personal mobility and temporary shelters and wearables, so that wearables could become shelters as well. So crossing the kind of deliberate line between wearable temporary shelters and, in a sense, architecture and fashion, or architecture and apparel. And they took inspiration from this image, Archigram's 1968 Cushicle and Sutaloon, which was a nomadic expandable shelter for the wearer. Those of us who lived through the 60s remember a lot of interest in nomadic shelter and nomadic housing. And this was a kind of wearable mobile home, which was a speculative design for a personal, individual, portable dwelling unit. And the students were really inspired by this, and led by the faculty member Anna Gittleson-Kahn. The four students were Daphne Chen, Ben Doctor, Noah Kantrowitz, and Elise Hugh. And if we go to the next slide, they started getting fascinated, believe it or not, by cockroaches. And in the Nature Lab, we have an entomologist who was talking about the notion of what makes a durable portable structure that allows for mobility and intense protection at the same time, and what better creature than the cockroach that can kind of live anywhere through anything. So they took a really deep dive into what made the cockroach such a successful structure and habitat. And if we go to the next slide, they looked at, this is a kind of dissection of the structure that allows the cockroach to have such a durable home that it wears. So it sort of fit directly into this line of research. And its chitinous exoskeleton and respiratory system enable it to, in a very sophisticated way, regulate its physiology so that it can thrive in high temperatures with little waters, and also can survive extreme compression, which became really fascinating to the textile artists, who really understand the notion of some of these elements and the way that they approach structural textiles. So if we go to the next one, this is also an animation that was a demonstration made to demonstrate the compression shell that allows the cockroach to breathe, how it takes in and lets out air. And so these principles were really studied through this 3D modeling technique. And one of the nice outcomes of, again, the students not having their regular tools and equipment was that none of them had done 3D modeling before. And they learned in a very short time to do these very sophisticated 3D models and renders and animations because they had to. So it opened up a whole new form of language for the team. And then this one is also an animation that dissects the individual parts that make the structure. And it's just a wonderful way to think about the kind of structures that could then be adapted to textile structures. And if you go to the next slide, this is a final study. This one doesn't animate, but it shows the structural composition of the skeleton that actually demonstrates how you could make a kind of spacer knit, is what they called it, which would be a double-layered circular knit with a cushion of air and spring-like yarns between the two sides so that it could replicate that sort of breathing apparatus and could sustain impact, but also regulate temperature and be self-insulating. So a very sophisticated derivation from a cockroach, right? And if you look at the actual result on the next slide, this is actually what the first knitted version with that kind of internal structure. So this is what two layers might look like in an actual knit. So through their research, they demonstrated the potential of developing a customizable, modular, and accessible textile that could be used for the creation of consumer goods at the intersection of architecture and apparel. In short, the description of a wearable temporary shelter. So it was such an interesting process, and of course Hyundai was very excited to be taken along on this adventuresome journey, and this work is actually continuing through the summer. They're going to be taking their early findings now to the next level. And so I think this is a kind of good example of, the new possible that we're talking about taking the difficulty of really challenging, in some ways even traumatic circumstances, and making something so positive and valuable and so growth inducing to come out of it. And it is in our mission, maybe we can go to the last slide, that we were always formed around working with industry. The original purpose of RISD was very much about innovating in materials and with industry and for new economies, and to bring the notion of design and making and fabrication into a continual level of evolution. It's very much still in our kind of DNA. And not long after Rhode Island went into lockdown, Governor Raimondo, Gina Raimondo, reached out to me about her hope that we could find a way that art could play a role in bringing Rhode Islanders together during this incredible, anxious, isolated period. So I put her in direct contact with Shepard Ferry, who is an alum and a trustee. He graduated in '92, and he's probably most known for many of you as the artist who created the Obama Hope poster, which is renowned. And if she got in touch with Shepard, and Shepard very generously jumped to the cause because he loves Rhode Island. And a few weeks later, the governor announced this hashtag Rhode Island Arts Initiative, which was encouraging individuals all around the state, from children to professional artists, to use art as a means of healing and community building and sharing. And she also unveiled Shepard's Rhode Island Angel of Hope and Strength, which Shepard created as a kind of monument of thanks to the first responders and also to the resilience of the Rhode Island community. So this image here is a projection. It's not actually on the building. We projected it around the city for many days in April when things were really difficult. In our experience of COVID, it's gotten better since then, but this was kind of at our peak. So it really resonated with people. And then Shepard also created a way you can download it on the Rhode Island COVID site, a way to print this out and have your own copy of this. And then his hope was that it would be displayed in windows, not just in Rhode Island, but around as a sort of thanks to first responders and symbol of hope. So again, I think a nice way to end this part of our talk, to talk about the new possible and the new ways of building community.
Such a great image to leave it on, Rosanne.
Thank you.
Sort of beacon of hope. I also have to just admire the dark humor of accepting the cockroach as an emblem of survivance and structural integrity at this time. I kind of like the mordant commentary that you might associate with that.
I didn't, just because of time, I didn't play. The sound group actually recorded the cockroach, and you have no idea what cockroaches sound like when their sound is magnified. It's like a haunting kind of animal sound. But anyway, maybe another lecture we can do the sound version.
Yeah, great. Okay, so it's a date, and I'm almost inclined to ask you how you're going to get that Superman building to be filled with farmland, but instead I'm going to go to the viewer questions. So we have a few. So let's see. Let's start with Julius Kavira. There are a couple of long questions in the chat box, but Julius, please join us in person if you like. Ask a question. And maybe too technically challenged to do that. Okay, so let's try reading it aloud.
Oh no, could you hear me now? Yeah, I'm really sorry for that.
It's always a little bit of a hiccup. Yeah, please go ahead and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, when I came in the beginning of I was a little late. I'm sorry for that, but we were talking about race and so forth, and there was a lot of current events that I think that we should not forget and let it, get overshadowed by all these wonderful other topics that is prevailing, whether that be politics, whether that be weather, and the hashtag Me Too movement. Not saying that, but I think that culturally, when it comes to civil rights, I think that we should really tackle that. And there's certain questions I brought up. It was how would I forget? I'm looking at my old question.
I thought the question about name dropping was particularly interesting. If you maybe want to read that.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you. Yeah, it's very cool. So in my critiques in my undergraduate, there was a lot of students that would say, "Well, I'm urban, and it is direct influence in my work," and they would have a rendition of it of a tile, which would be abstract, or even just an abstract work. And it was very troubling for me because I myself wouldn't know where to begin to tackle that in the classroom. And as I want to be a teacher or instruct or be, I don't know, some kind of influence, how would I tackle that when I'm in that situation? It's kind of troublesome, and I would love to hear your input. And as well as a whole, I mean, not only do I feel responsible, I feel that everybody is responsible, and I wouldn't want to be the only one who's being how you say accountable.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible to teach right now without changing your teaching practice to understand the embedded issues of denying race problems. Every faculty member has to redo their curriculum and syllabi right now. And at RISD, we've created this teaching and learning lab where we're actually engaged in a project called Decolonializing the Curriculum, and 12 faculty each semester are being released from a class and going and doing this work to understand how to bring new influences into the classroom, how to really look at the what they're using as references and how they're talking about the histories of their fields, because there's so much baked into those histories that is continued racism. So it's not going to happen overnight for sure, but the important thing is that schools recognize what the problems are and just make a commitment to moving forward, changing the curricula to be inclusive, to recognize the different questions that individuals who have had very different lives and who experience very different realities just walking out the door of their homes, what their experiences are, that all of that has to reconfigure what happens in the classroom and how it's taught. And so we're going through a major upheaval in education finally, and I would say at RISD we're not I will not in any way say that we're where we need to be. We are at the start of this, although I think we are ahead of some places. We're way behind where we need to be. So we're taking this on with real intentionality. It is the future, and the demographic shifts that are happening in the world and in America demand this, because any educational structure that is not reconfiguring its content and its expectations of what excellence is and what legacy means, those are all loaded terms. And if anyone refuses to take it on, they're going to be irrelevant in 10 years. And I don't want to see RISD certainly be irrelevant.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question, Julian. And let's now go to Meena Sadnarian, who I think, Meena, you might have a related question for Rosanne.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Yeah, no, we're getting her yet. I'll just go ahead and read it. It's a short question. In RISD's attempt to understand the structural racism that affects the educational process, what you've just been describing, does the school wish to involve concerned alumni in this task? And she said she herself is an alumna. So what's the role of the alumni in the conversation we're having?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, RISD is a community, and being an alumna is just a different phase of your relationship with the institution. So absolutely, it has to be not just in the classroom, it has to be something that the entire institution takes on. It has to be at the leadership level. And, I think that's one of the hardest areas to change because there isn't a lot of turnover in certain leadership positions, but our board is on board, and we're working very hard to look at a board that is representative of our communities, our student communities. And so we've made a lot of progress in the last few years, but the board is absolutely committed to this work. And, we've created the Social Equity and Inclusion Center with an incredible leader, Dr. Matthew Shinoda, who is building a whole office of resource and action that is initiating a number of things that have begun to bubble in the last few years and have had impact, but is really just getting rolling. So the viewpoints of alums are critical. To know how your RISD education resonates in the world and what your experiences were and what you can help us frame in our understanding of what they should be moving forward.
Great, thank you. And let's take, I think, just one last question, which is from Fahad Al-Abadli. Fahad, are you with us?
Hi.
Hi, Fahad. Good to see you again.
Hi, nice to see you again. It's an amazing session. Thank you so much, Rosanne. Literally, what the first pictures you showed was resonating with us, because here in Qatar we have Virginia Commonwealth University, and the campus look exactly the same, and it's almost terrifying. Actually, some of the question was already answered in the chat room, but there's one question what I'm really interested in. More about is the university it's funded, because I know it's privately funded. What fundraising method the university follow in order to remain or make sure it's more sustainable? Is it by the board, or there is a different style of fundraising?
Sure. So we have a whole division of institutional engagement, which oversees fundraising and alumni relations and government relations. And so we have a very complex staff of people who are engaging involvement with the school in all different ways, from grants and foundation funding to private individual funding. And what's exciting, I think, and important, and it relates to the conversation we've been having around change, is that we can set our priorities and build around those. So, for example, we just instituted a program for the first time where we have 6 fully funded graduate educations now at RISD. And the kind of student that we attracted to that program would never have come to RISD because it's a very expensive school. And the students that got in are stellar. They're going to be leaders in the field moving forward. But the opportunity of opening access, to a free RISD education for, I wish it were more, but as a start for 6 individuals was 100% because of fundraising. So, the combination of fundraising and our priorities kind of finding one another. But it's, as time goes on, the model of higher ed is completely unsustainable. And it's something that we were looking at very carefully in our strategic plan before the COVID pandemic, and now we have a big setback. So we're going to have to use the same methodology that I've been showing you in the creativity of our students in taking adverse times and making something magical happen. We're going to now have to do that to an institution and figure out how to make the priorities that we feel are essential for art and design education come through with all of the incredible challenges we have financially, and all higher education and arts culture institutions are facing. So fundraising is a key part. And if you know of anyone that's interested in supporting higher education at the Rhode Island School of Design, please put them in touch with me.
That's a precedent at work. Thanks, Fahad, for your question. And Rosanne, can I just ask you one last question just from myself?
Sure.
So we've known each other for a long time.
Yes.
And of course, we first came into contact with one another through the Furniture Society. Yes. And you were, and still are, a great furniture maker, designer. I understand you have had long had a practice of making at least one project per year, just to keep your hand in, literally. Yeah. And what I want to ask you is, do you think your background as a furniture maker and designer prepared you for this moment? And if so, how?
Yeah, no, I get asked this a lot. I got asked it in a different way, where people said, how was it for you to give up your practice as a designer maker?
Which is different.
And I, my answer was always, I haven't given it up. It's just I'm using the same methodologies to actually help to build a school and a series of fields. So it's transferable information. I believe that a real education is not one where you learn how to do a thing. It's where you learn how to build a body of knowledge that gives you the flexibility to do multiple things with that knowledge and build on a foundational set of competencies and critical ways of thinking about problem formulation and then making new outcomes. That's in any design field, in any making field. If you take it at that level of kind of the 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 intersection between the intellect and the desire to say something new and the making of that thing. So it's very much, I wouldn't say, I don't want to be, trite and say that RISD is like a giant piece of furniture. It's not. It's many other things, and it's very complex. But as a leader, I think a design education is about the best, that and some financial knowledge and some knowledge of things like boards and laws and compliance and a million other boring things. But the design education itself, I think, is really what's needed to help higher education get through an unbelievably challenging time that will last into the future.
Great, thank you. I know I said that was going to be my last question, but I do have one more. Would you like to introduce your adorable dog?
Oh, yes. I would love to. She usually is much fluffier, but this is Cleo, and she has been completely spoiled by having a constant companion since March. I don't know what's going to happen when we go off remote. It's devastating. Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard the joke circulating the rounds that this is all a conspiracy by the dogs. They're finally getting exactly what they wanted. Okay, well, next time we have a really fantastic guest who is actually going to help us fill in some of the conversations we've just had about race and institutional dynamics. And that's Craig Wilkins, who's a noted historian of the African-American role and subjectivity and architectural history. And he's particularly going to be sharing his thoughts about what he calls hip hop architecture, which is a very dynamic and expansive concept. And you'll just have to tune in to understand the full measure of it. So please join us again on Friday. And last but certainly not least, I just want to thank you, Rosanne, for joining us today. It's been fantastic to talk to you. And I just feel like in the future, historians will also be turning back to this conversation. I'm so glad we have it recorded because you're really at the front lines here. And, I think everybody in the art and design field owes you a great debt of gratitude for everything you're putting to the cause. So thanks so much
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Friedman Benda. It was great. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.